So guys, today we're gonna make a traditional mead with Crucifixion Thorn honey.
Yes.
Let's try it first. Do we have like a spoon, or we can just go like check out the lid?
Yeah,
nice.
That's usually what I do.
All right. That is like, look at the gooey crystals forming in this. It's like got this gray, crazy like looking honey. Stuff in there. Oh man.
It's kind of tart.
That's really good.
It's got a lot of particles in there.
Yeah.
I wonder if this is just what's kind of come to the top in
usually,
the bucket.
Yeah, it rises. All the bee particles.
Yeah, the good stuff.
Yeah.
It's funny, people always ask, like, oh, do you guys use like filtered honey or is it just raw? And I'm like, if you've ever looked inside of a beehive, there's bugs and insect things because, you know, it's out in nature. And so you have to like coarse filter any kind of honey or else you're literally going to be having like bug juice.
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
Which I guess is kind of what honey is in some ways anyways. But yeah, so what kind of flavors are you guys getting out of this?
Yeah, I'm getting like a darker berry.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it's just the particles and how this is coming together from the top of the bucket, but there's almost a vanilla flavor in the aftertaste for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Kind of creamy,
It's got a very like fluffy mouthfeel to it.
Yeah.
Yeah, kind of like marshmallow, which is, I know, like a flavor in a lot of honeys, like Tupelo sometimes.
Tupelo for
can
sure.
have some marshmallow in there.
I think this is definitely the most like Tupelo that I've tried.
Yeah.
This is wild.
Awesome.
So the Crucifixion Thorn is this crazy looking plant. I don't know if you guys have seen it hiking. I just looked it up and I'm like, oh yeah, I've run into that a few times.
Yeah.
And it's got these big old spikes, and they say it looks like, you know, the crown of thorns from, you know, the Last Supper days or whatever. And it grows all around, you know, the Southwest and California deserts. And so it's kind of cool that whenever, you know, a beekeeper can pinpoint the dominant nectar source of a honey, they get to declare varietal.
Right.
And so it's really, I mean, it's just an awesome name. Crucifixion Thorn sounds pretty wild. But yeah, this is truly a unique honey. And the bees were working in the area. You guys been to Sedona?
Yeah.
So you get off I-17 and the 179 to go up to Sedona. So that's right where the hives were, which is kind of cool.
Right.
So it's neat in this project where we're doing, you know, 9 different traditional meads from different parts of the state. We're gonna have maps on the label, and then we'll do a blend of all 9 for like the 10th one, signifying our 10th year we're just getting into now. And yeah, I'm excited for this project to come out. So we got a couple more of these to make.
Yeah.
So let's get to it.
Let's do it.
What's this top step rated for? I'll support it
More
for
than
you.
60. We're good. There goes.
So, you know, in mead making, we do so many crazy flavors and we use different fruits and cacao nibs and barrels. But for me, a traditional mead it's kind of like the Pilsner, the lager, the mead world, right?
Right.
We want to really showcase the ingredient, and this is the best way to do it. And,
absolutely.
And our goal in all of these traditionals is to have them be, you know, sweet, where the flavor of the honey is really expressed.
Right.
And so if we ferment these dry and left it that way, well, it's also like a great way to show your skill set because there's nowhere to hide anything, right?
Exactly.
But you also don't get the full expression of the honey.
No.
So we're going to do all of these as like sweet traditionals, and we're going to have I'm calling them sliders on the label. We're going to discuss like the sweetness or the minerality or some different aspects of the honey. And it's going to be kind of fun to get a traditional flight and try, okay, here's some mesquite from this part of the state, and here's Crucifixion Thorn and brittle bush. And it's also fun, you know, we also talked to, you know, one of the beekeepers that actually delivered the honey, you know, back in the spring where we started making this project come together. And it's so neat to get information from those guys and to really learn about the people that are, you know, I mean, you have to be passionate to be a beekeeper, and also kind of badass because those guys are always like walking around with just like a jacket on, and they're like, yeah, they always say like, I never get stung, and then whenever I'm around they start getting stung, and they've already said I don't get stung, it doesn't, then they can't show any pain, you know?
Right.
Cool. So we'll get some water in this one. Start diluting it, but we can move on to another full bucket for now.
Cool.
Hand you this.
Drippy drip.
Thank you.
All right, 60 pounds.
No big
so
deal.
A gallon of honey weighs 12 pounds more or less. And when we're making a batch of mead, what's kind of cool is the sugar level scales up, just like same as a 5-gallon batch as you would make in a 5,000-gallon batch. Not that we've done 5,000 yet, but we've done just under 2,000 gallons.
It's getting bigger and bigger.
3,000 ciders.
Yeah, for sure. So if you had 5 gallons, like these are 5-gallon buckets, and if you had 5 gallons of a total batch, every pound of honey equals 1% alcohol by volume if you fermented it dry.
Right.
It's kind of cool.
That is.
It's interesting how trying honey is kind of like trying wine, where you're, picking out the flavor characteristics.
Right.
Sometimes they're in your face, and sometimes they're really subtle.
Yeah, sometimes you kind of have to search for them. So right now we're just adding the honey to some water. We're also oxygenating it at the same time, and that's for the yeast health. So just like us, yeast needs oxygen to breathe.
So one of the differences between making mead and beer wine is how we manage our fermentation.
Yeah.
And so we're infusing food-grade oxygen into this mix because as the yeast begins its life cycle to ferment the sugars, turn them into alcohol and flavors, it needs oxygen to grow the acrospore, which is the bud that begins to form ultimately another yeast cell. And so we're going to assist the microscopic yeast that we put into this must. Must is unfermented wine, mead, cider, wort, and beer. So we're going to oxygenate the must. We're also going to add some vitamins like B12, and we call those yeast nutrients. And honey by itself, while it makes amazing mead, right? That's why we're doing this after all. It actually doesn't have the amount of nutrients that the yeast really want. So when you're making wine or beer, when you have fruit, or if we're fermenting with fruit for that matter, which we do all the time, the yeast is going to have a healthier environment. It's going to have more nutrients to pull from those ingredients in order to do its job and go through its life cycle. And so we're going to assist that process. And the way that we do that, the temperature that we maintain, the pH that's going on, all of these factors have to be identified and monitored throughout the process of fermentation. And this tool is like the best $2 you can ever spend in your life. So this just lifts a bucket lid off, which sounds pretty simple, and it is, but without this tool, you're using your fingers, and like I've almost lost fingernails before because, you're really prying on that thing, and you're using like any rock climber skills maybe you used to have to get a bucket lid off, and this guy will just pop them right off. It was like an epiphany the day I was buying honey at Crockett's, and I saw this hanging on the wall, and I went,
you're like, oh, I could
is this
use
what
that.
I think it's for? Yeah, done.
I didn't know we had those for the first few months. Very excited when I found them. Thank you, Tim. It's going to give us about 80 gallons of mead. Probably around 14% alcohol. We're doing 9 different batches with different varietals of honey, so it's really important that each one, elevates that flavor we're looking for.
Oop. I almost wore some honey.
All right, so this is our last bucket. Yeah, and as we're putting this honey in, you can see that we're recirculating the solution to kind of help dissolve the honey into the water. If you dump this much honey straight in, it kind of falls to the bottom. So it's important to mix it up and make sure it's nice and homogenized.
And when I was making mead as a home brewer, I had a paddle function on the end of like an extension for your drill.
Yep.
Stainless steel, and I would just sanitize that and then kind of spin it, and that would get everything mixed up because, I wound up getting a small pump as a home brewer by the time I was, done, as you keep adding gear to your setup.
Right.
But yeah, so that's, I guess, one difference between home brewing is we're able to, pump and pull. You can see this lower valve on the tank. It's pulling everything, within an inch of the bottom, in and back, and we're just using this to mix it up. And that's also going to help get all the oxygen evenly distributed, and we can hit about 25 parts per million oxygen. As a home brewer, just by stirring, if you don't have an O2 setup, you can get about 8 parts per million, and that's better than, yeah, better than nothing.
Yeah.
So if you're doing this at home, it is important to, we just call it aerating during the beginning of fermentation, and very important not to aerate to the best of your abilities after fermentation's over. So oxygen's good for about the first third of fermentation, and if you start to add oxygen after that point, it can create some off flavors. It's actually not great for what you're trying to do.
Yeah, can start introducing oxidation at that point. Yeah, and since honey is void of many proteins, it's important that we oxygenate at a pretty high level just to maintain that yeast health. Compared to yeast and beer, grain has so many proteins in it, doesn't need quite as much. Cool. Yeah, we'll start rinsing these buckets out and get every last drop of this honey in there because we want all of it.
So when I was a home brewer, I would always use Arrowhead spring water just because it worked.
Yeah.
And I was like, might as well stick with what works. And when we built this facility, we knew that we didn't want to have chlorine and chloramines from the city water in our mead, which keeps the population healthy, but it's not necessarily something you want to ferment with.
No.
And so all of the water in our building, I always joke that even the toilets are filtered here, goes through a GAC filter. So we've got rocks and sand and charcoal in this big filter housing, and it backflushes itself every night to kind of clean out whatever it's trapped there. And that's kind of cool. And it's interesting to think that, at least in a traditional mead like this, I mean, water's the #1 ingredient.
Right. And so something like those minerals can completely change our flavor.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just especially with a delicate product like this.
It's funny, I just saw definitely a bee part in here.
I've found a few bee heads, some stingers. You find particles in here. Yeah, we usually do a 2-step filtration for our meads because we want it really clear. So this will definitely get filtered.
Well, it's funny to think that, at this point, we're one of the largest producers of mead anywhere. We're still, we haven't lost sight of the humbleness of how small we are compared to, the wine and beer worlds. But as far as mead goes, we're doing some pretty cool stuff, and we're still doing this.
Yeah.
We still take the time to work with local ingredients whenever we can and to really showcase them like we're doing in this project.
Right.
And we're still stirring honey in buckets by hand because that's how you do it.
That's how you do it. It helps too when you carry it over to the larger scale stuff. It reminds you of the attention to detail and how important it is.
Absolutely. Beverage, I actually used honey bears to make a batch of mead commercially.
How many bears did that take?
It was a ridiculous amount of cases of honey bears. And it was actually Arizona mesquite honey that was packaged in honey bears. And I just, in the beginning of this business venture, you're trying to figure out your supply chain. Where am I going to get everything from? And I was like at Costco and I found Arizona honey in honey bears. And I'm like, well, that's the only way I got to make this mead tomorrow.
Yeah. It's not going to be easy, but.
So I was shaking up honey bears with hot water to, you want to get every drop of honey.
Drop out. Sometimes
I only
you got to put
once.
in that work.
Yeah.
Yeah, luckily the buckets are a little bit easier than the bears. Usually we have about 2-ton heavy totes full of honey. It's 350 gallons? The totes we buy in?
I think they're 300, but I haven't seen an invoice in a minute. Right, I think this guy's ready for a pitch. All right.
You want to do the honors?
Yes, sir. .9% of the honey. As a meadery, first of all, is that what we do is still relatively unknown, right? I mean, mead is not a household name.
No.
And so just the education piece that is required to be successful as a business can't be stressed enough. The other challenge we have that kind of adds to that first challenge is that honey is really expensive. And this is the defining ingredient in almost everything that we make here, certainly all of our meads. And even the ingredients that go into our cider, we spare no expense.
Right.
In our packaging, we hand label everything that's not screen printed. So much attention to detail and care goes into what we do at Superstition.
Right.
And honey is expensive. I would say probably the most expensive, if mead is commonly used fermentable ingredient out there.
Absolutely, especially these varietals. And getting this much of it alone is hard.
And you're right, when we buy Arizona wildflower and mesquite honey, we're buying in such a volume that, you know,
Right.
we're able to get the price down compared to sourcing from a small local beekeeper, and we'll spend 2 to 3 times the price per pound to get this honey.
Right.
And you know, when we're buying at wholesale, obviously it's less than what you'd pay at a grocery store, but think like when you go to a grocery store and you're getting like a half pound of honey, and sometimes it's like $6-8 for
Yeah, it's not cheap.
even, I mean, a non-local whatever honey, you know, from
Right.
you don't even know.
Yeah.
And so by having a cool connection with local beekeepers and honey packers around the state, we're able to source these really interesting honeys. And yeah, it is rare. I mean, we're using these buckets because it's not in drums. It's not in a
Right.
300-gallon tote that we can use our crazy honey pump to move it. It's kind of cool.
It is. It's awesome. Awesome too that there's this much honey in Arizona, that you can find 9 different varietals in Arizona.
Yeah, no kidding, dude. Yeah, it's cool how, because of the seasons here, and just the way things are. Like people think of Arizona, I know I always did, as just being a desert.
Yeah, exactly.
But half our state is high elevation with mountains. I mean, you look out here, you can see a 12,000-foot mountain out our window, you know?
Absolutely.
And so beekeepers in a lot of parts of the country, they make honey usually like once a year, sometimes twice, and beekeepers here can actually pull 3 times from really successful hives.
Right.
So yeah, Arizona, I don't know where we stand in honey production, you know, rankings, but I would imagine,
We got to be up there.
yeah, for sure.
Cool.
All right,
Well, this one's ready for you.
another bucket.